qualities, protects the environment, meets high quality and safety standards, and treats farm animals humanely. Interestingly, nothing was said about the treatment of workers. But increasing consumer demand for natural and organic foods does not necessarily ensure that such foods will be ethical. In 2006, Walmart, your favorite company back there, announced that it would offer a wide range of organic products, but the price premium would be just 10% above conventionally produced items. Thus, organic producers will have to adopt the economies of scale associated with industrial agriculture. In fact, organic concentrated animal feeding operations, CAFOs, already exist. Walmart may be forcing its organic growers to exchange higher price premiums for greater volumes and profits through economies of scale. But the typical food shopper still spends more than twice as much to fill her shopping cart with organic foods than with conventional ones. Organic farms have historically been smaller and more labor intensive than conventional ones, and production costs on small farms tend to average more than double the unit cost on large farms. But as the organic market share increases, spurred by growing demand, organic production costs are likely to decline, and production is likely to become more concentrated as it has in conventional agriculture. The United Nations predicts that the world population will climb from the current 7 billion to about 9.1 billion in 2050. This is a frightening figure, but it's made all the more frightening because rising levels of disposable income in developing nations generate increases in meat consumption. Sorry, you can back up one more for me. Among the world's poorest countries, meat consumption increased by more than 300% during the last 4 decades of the 20th century. Even so, as this shows, high-income countries' meat consumption continues to dwarf that of low-income countries. Livestock currently contributes 40% of the global value of agricultural production. It provides 15% of total food industry energy and 25% of dietary protein. It supports the livelihood and food security of 1 billion people. 35% of the world's grain harvest is devoted to producing animal protein. And as a result, the future of meat consumption will have a large impact on global food security. Animals do not convert grains into flesh with equal efficiency. Cattle's feed conversion ratio, the amount of grain it takes to put on 1 pound of gain of live weight, is about 10 to 1. So a cow has to eat 10 pounds of grain to put on 1 pound of meat. It's about 5 to 1 for hogs, 2 to 1 for chickens, and for farm fish, it's less than 2 to 1. Thanks to more efficient feed conversion and much shorter generation intervals from birth to dinner plate, poultry and pork production have surpassed beef production worldwide. Aquaculture has been the fastest growing source of animal protein since 1990, and it too will soon pass beef production. Meat consumption worldwide rose from 44 million tons in 1950 to 284 million tons in 2009. That's a jump, 6-fold jump. The Food and Agriculture Organization reports on the state of food and agriculture in the world in 2010 predicted that meat production will need to double by the year 2050 to satisfy current world demand for animal protein. If that's the case, then short of drastically reducing meat consumption worldwide, which many people advocate, what are we going to do? Before we decide that, I want to give you the results of one other study. The World Wildlife Fund commissioned a study of Great Britain, of the United Kingdom, about its food consumption, and that study concluded that, and I quote, a switch from beef and milk to highly refined livestock analogs such as tofu could actually increase the quantity of arable land needed to supply the United Kingdom's food needs. So just switching away from beef doesn't mean we're going to solve all these problems, because we have to grow more We have to grow more grains, and that means we're going to have to need more arable land to grow them. So, switching away from beef and dairy to tofu would mean that greater imports of food to the United Kingdom would stress forests, would require greater amounts of uncultivated land currently to go into production. Now there's other alternatives. Some people advocate the uses of other sources of protein like insects. Insects are high in protein, high in vitamins and minerals, and low in fat. They don't take much room. There are over 1,000 edible species known today, and people in many parts of the developing world already eat insects. Other people are waiting for the scientific breakthroughs that promise to make edible meats in the lab. Patents have already been taken out in Holland and the United States to make in vitro meat from stem cells. None of these solutions seem likely to curb the world's continued hunger for meat, however. So production must become more efficient. Supplementing other feed grains with protein-rich soybean meal boosts feed conversion ratios. This is already being done in China, Brazil, and the United States, which are the world's leading producers of meat. And these greater efficiencies are bound to industrial models of production. So industrial meat is the product of many actors, from growers to consumers, from processors to retailers, from multinational corporations to unauthorized immigrant workers. It epitomizes what the economist Joseph Schumpeter called capitalism's creative destruction. Companies rise and fall, all the while providing meat to an ever-expanding market. The beef trust that dominated North America when Upton Sinclair wrote The Jungle, Swift, Cudahy, Morrell, Armour, Morris, survive only in a few brand names. The firms that revolutionized the industry in the 1960s and 70s, IBP and Conagra Red Meats, had disappeared as well, absorbed by a new generation of companies, most notably Tyson and Brazilian-owned JBS. The forces of creative destruction within the industry have affected plant locations and labor force composition. They've stymied efforts to reform it. Companies come and go, but the industrial system seems destined to remain the dominant method of meat production, although hopefully a more humane one. Integrated ecological alternatives will undoubtedly serve the needs of some, but they seem unlikely to threaten the hegemony of industrial meat production for all but the wealthiest eaters in high-income nations. And now I'm riding off into the sunset, and thank you very much. I'll be happy to answer a sort of a whirlwind tour of my view of what meat, where it came from, where it's at today, and where it may be going.
I like your horse.
I do too. He's on the saddle tied up to the hitching post right outside.
Have farm or the workers that we're talking about, have they been successful at all in unionizing?
Well,
Could you repeat the question for a second?
have workers been successful in unionizing? Kansas, as you know, is a right-to-work state. Some of the beef plants in Kansas are unionized, some are not. In Dodge City, the Cargill plant and the National plants are unionized, the Tyson plants are not.
Do you see a difference between those plants in terms of worker welfare?
I would rather work in a unionized plant, but I wouldn't make any more in a unionized plant. My working conditions would not be any safer.
Really?
My management would not be any nicer to me. It doesn't make that much difference.
So the union isn't doing its job?
Well, unions have been emasculated, and there were master contracts in meatpacking and many other industries in the early part of the 20th century. Meatpacking led the way in unionization in the late 19th and early 20th century, but as we all know, unions have been, only about 7% of private American workers today are unionized. And union contracts now are limited to the plant. So the Tyson, the biggest plant in the world at Dakota City, Nebraska, the Tyson plant, it's unionized. It has gone through bitter strikes over the last 50 years. They just got a new contract which raised the wages of production workers to starting at between $13 and $14, depending on what job they do and whether they're on the kill floor or the processing floor. But those increases in wages will not apply to the Tyson plant in Finney County at Holcomb. So those workers are not unionized, and Tyson will do everything possible to keep that plant from being unionized. So the leadership of UFCW, United Food and Commercial Workers, the main union, not the only one, but the main union for meatpacking workers, the leadership of that union looks primarily like the management in those plants.
Oh, man.
They're largely white, middle-aged, native-born Americans. The workers in those plants are primarily people of color, primarily immigrants from Latin America. Increasingly, the workers are refugees in the case of the Tyson plant in Garden City, from Burma or Myanmar and from Somalia. There are rumors that Syrians are now showing up in Wichita and will soon be in the plants in western Kansas. Jennifer and I heard that discussion earlier before Christmas, whether we haven't yet had that confirmed, but wherever there is strife, economic or political strife in the world, and people leave and are given refugee status in the United States, those people will end up in meat plants.
So worker welfare is an unsolvable problem?
I wouldn't say it's unsolvable. But it is. Upton Sinclair, when he wrote The Jungle, said, "I aimed at America's heart and I hit it in its stomach." And that continues to be the primary concern of Americans, that my meat is safe and good for me. There's nothing wrong with those concerns, but that there's less concern with worker welfare. And of course, we see that in the increasing dichotomy between rich folks and poor folks.
Okay.
And so I'm not optimistic that things will change dramatically anytime soon. There have been improvements. Ergonomically, there have been improvements in the workplace, but it still remains a low-wage job. You don't have to speak English to work in a meat plant. You don't have to have any kind of formal education. You don't have to have any pre-existing job skills. You have to be able to pass the drug test, the urine test, and you have to be able to stand on the line and do the same thing thousands of times a day. Yes, sir.
You may recall, most of you, that during the Olympics in London, they started with a pastoral scene, and then very shortly the rise of the industrial age, and they went on. And the only place in the scenes of our development, human development, that I felt comfortable and at peace with it was the pastoral scenes. And I'm increasingly, the older I get, the more I'm alienated from what we've done to this planet. And I'm wondering, I'm sitting here, how do you cope, because you have really delved into this subject. How do you keep from being just totally put off by it? I mean, like I want to run and hide out.
Well, I started out my career as an anthropologist studying American Indians and studying alcohol use among American Indians. And I got to the point in the mid-1980s where I didn't really see, this was pre-casino period, I didn't really see much promise for improving conditions of American Indians. They tend to still be the most disadvantaged ethnic group in the United States. And so and they weren't that interested in having me poking around either. So, you know, the joke is that an American Indian family consists of husband and wife, their children, and an anthropologist. And that's true. And actually, Jennifer and I live with an American Indian in Garden City. So life imitating jokes. So I went from there to meatpacking. So that, I'm kind of a doom and gloom guy. I just like things that don't have much possibility of getting better. No, that's not true. I think that there have been encouraging changes. We have seen a growing concern on the part of governments and food providers to improve animal welfare. So we know that consumers can make a difference, that companies like McDonald's and Burger King and all of the food chains are increasingly mandating that the animals that the meat that they buy is raised in more humane conditions. We have not seen, however, a similar kind of large concern on the part of consumers for the conditions of workers. And until we do, I think we're not there. That is what will be needed. We are seeing increasingly people voting with their forks, and so if I can afford, my children are grown, I have a good job, I can afford to, I'm an investor in iWeeks Dairy. I own 2 shares of that local dairy. I can afford to drive across the river. I can afford to pay a premium price for milk because I believe, well, it tastes better for one thing, but I believe in small producers and buying locally. I buy my beef from a colleague who raises grass-fed beef down around the Newton area. So I can do that, and many other people can do the same thing, but not everybody can. And we have to find, and there will, I think, be this alternative food stream, organic, natural, local, that we see, but it primarily today serves high-income, well-educated people who can afford to pay a bit more for their food. We could increase the wages on meat packing workers by a good amount, and it would add just a penny or two to the price of our meat. We could do that, but we would have to pressure those companies, primarily the companies who are buying that meat, in order to get that to happen, I think.
Yeah, what are 1 or 2 significant advocacy groups on behalf of the workers that are working to improve working conditions?
Well, the UFCW for one. I'm on the board of directors of the Organization for Competitive Markets, which is an organization primarily of cattle producers who are concerned that the increasing concentration that those graphs showed you is putting farmers and ranchers out of business, and that the small farmer is threatened. And so we have engaged in litigation, and we're currently actually involved in challenging the beef checkoff. The beef checkoff, every time a producer sells a cow, $1 goes into the checkoff. It's about $40-some-odd million a year nationally. Checkoff programs, that checkoff's been around since the mid-1980s. There are checkoff programs in all sorts of commodities. And they fund the commercial like beef is what's for dinner, got milk, pork the other white meat. Those 3 ads we're all familiar with came from checkoff money. But there are lots of other checkoffs. We maintain that the National Cattlemen's Beef Association is really in bed with the meat packers and is using that money, which is coming from producers, to essentially oppose many things that we believe would benefit producers. For example, country of origin labeling. Country of origin labeling, small producers fought very hard to get that. It's now the law of the land, but it is increasingly opposed, has been opposed from the very beginning by the NCBA, by the packers. Of course, Canada and Mexico don't like it, and there is a complaint before the World Trade Organization saying that we shouldn't be able to label our meat. I mean, personally, I would like to know what country my meat comes from. And I buy locally. I look at the labels on clothing and food, and whenever possible, I buy stuff that's made in the United States. That's my own personal politics. And you all may not share that, but you ought to have a right to know where your food comes from. But COOL has been opposed by the National Cattlemen's Beef Association and others. So we are hoping that ultimately the beef checkoff and other checkoffs will be made voluntary so that producers do not have to contribute to organizations that are in direct opposition to their interests. RCAF is another producer organization. I can't tell you what it stands for. It's an acronym. It's
What are the letters on that?
R-CAF, C-A-L-F, RCAF USA. And it is the main producer group that is opposes the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. National Farmers Union, and every state has its own farmers union, Kansas, Nebraska, but the National Farmers Union is also very, very important in terms of fighting for the rights of small producers. Workers not, processing workers not so much, but
Small farmers.
but small farmers are, there is a growing movement and many of us are buying our food from farmers markets and from local producers, or going places like the Merck and buying that stuff there. Just because it's organic, however, doesn't mean that it's produced by some fuzzy-cheeked, Birkenstock-wearing organic farmer. It may be produced by exploitation of immigrant labor, for that matter.
So if ECM or some local church congregation wanted to get involved on behalf of the workers, just focusing on the workers and work safety and humane working conditions, which of these organizations should they connect with?
There's a group called Appleseed. I know they've got offices in Nebraska, I think also in Kansas. I can get you that information, Forrest. I would also say the Kansas Rural Center, which has been very active in opposing legislation that was brought last year to Paul Johnson is the person I would contact. And he is a lobbyist in Topeka. He's also well connected to lots of these organizations. There was a bill introduced last year that would have, Kansas still has limits on corporate farming. They aren't very many, they're almost all gone, but it still has some. And there was an effort by legislators last year to eliminate those. There was testimony by a number of people, including I testified as well, that saying that we should keep those, that the law would have eliminated any kind of control over any kind of agriculture.